다들 예동 유습실력 하는 많은 거 야채 니마 시버디 저게
Today is the fourth day of the Marangok Summer Teachings in 2024. To begin with, I'd like to offer my greetings to the ocean of members of the Sangha listening over the internet, as well as all the other people listening on the internet. Now, the main topic of our teaching this evening is going to be the connection between secret mantra and the and early Buddhism. Now, the main topic of the Marangok Summer Teachings is the origin of the secret mantra. This is the topic that we're working with. But if we're talking about the origins of secret mantra, now, during the time of early Buddhism, there was no philosophy and practice of the secret mantra Vajrayana as we have today. But during the time of early Buddhism, there were like the seeds of the view and practice. You can say that they're mere seeds of the Vajrayana practice. And so I thought we ought to speak a little bit about them. So first of all, we need to take up a secret mantra and a clear realization. So if we speak about this in terms of the combination between secret mantra and clear realization, there are generally two different ways. Now, the general way that it's described is that most academic researchers and scholars hold that early Buddhism as a religion that follows the nature of things. It follows logic. They say it is this kind of a religion. So many scholars hold that when they do their research, they say that there's really no particular relation between the Buddha's awakening to complete enlightenment and the secret mantra. And the reason for this is that when the Buddha taught or achieved enlightenment and then turned the wheel of Dharma, at that time there was no discussion of secret mantra, and so at that point, so in this way, there could not have been any particular relation between the Buddha achieving enlightenment and the secret mantra. So there are many scholars who say this. Now, the reason why these scholars hold these views or why they take these positions is that fundamentally, is that the Buddha, the Dharma that the Buddha clearly realized, or the achievement of the Buddha's achieved, is not achieved through blind faith. It was achieved through prajna. It was not related to blind faith or superstition. So the wisdom in the Buddha's mind stream is said to be like light. It's said to be luminous. It's not darkness. It's not said to be like dark or pitch black. And so, for this reason, within early Buddhism, the state of Buddhahood is something that comes through logic. It comes through prajna. It is not something that happened through superstition or blind faith. At that time in India, there were many superstitious religions, but the Buddhist religion was not followed logic, and so the result of Buddhahood is not a result that's achieved through superstition or blind faith. In the four agamis, the state of the Buddha that the Buddha manifested, or when you talk about the manner in which the Buddha realized the nature of things, the explanation is as described as this. And this is in the connected discourses where these words appear. So these are the words. So this is something that I translated very quickly. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know. But this is the basic meaning, I believe. So at that time, the Bhagavan spoke to the group of 5 monks. When there is proper consideration of the truth of suffering, of this Dharma never heard before, vision arises, wisdom arises, prajna arises, awareness arises, and light arises. When there is proper consideration of the noble truths of the origin, the cessation of suffering, the path of the cessation of suffering, of this Dharma never heard before, vision arises, wisdom arises, prajna arises, awareness arises, and light arises. And so what this is saying is that when the Buddha awoke to completely perfect enlightenment, all phenomena became the object that he had clear realization of. And when he awakened to enlightenment, when his realization became manifest in his mind, it was like there was light. There were no phenomena that he did not see or did not know. It's like there was light. And so this was light arises, luminous. It's like the entire world, or the entire, or he had the appearance of all worlds being filled with light. And so it's like vision arises, wisdom arises, prajna arises, awareness arises, and light arises, as it says. And so because of this, the darkness of ignorance, there could not be any darkness of ignorance or unknowing at all. So it's like everything was filled with light. And the nature of everything, and he was able to see the nature of everything exactly as it was. It's like you could see all phenomena directly in its perception. This is what this says. And so for this reason, there are other quotes about this, and I don't need to recite that. Now, this is something that I translated, but I'm not sure whether it's accurate, and so for the other one, I don't need to read it. In any case, what these sutras teach is that when the Buddha awoke to Buddhahood, the way it appeared to him at that time, or the experience or understanding he had, is described in many different instances. And so when they explain the sort of image or the way he saw the realization, it is that he saw that the Dharma is something that must be realized by each individual. So it's something that every individual needs to clearly realize for themselves and needs to know for themselves. And yet, but the Dharma that is clearly realized is a Dharma that transcends the time. So the truth of the nature of things of 2,500 years ago, that the Buddha saw, and that now 2,500 years later, the nature of all things is still exactly the same. It's not like over the course of 2,500 years, the nature, the way things are, the actual things are changed. So the nature that the Buddha saw 2,500 years ago, and the year that the nature of things that we have now did not change. It's not like they're different. So the nature of things at any time, no matter what era, is truth by nature. It's like the nature of things, and so there's no way that it can change. Likewise, that time of truth is when the Buddha saw it, that nature of things is exactly the same for all of people. Now, we can't see what the Buddha saw, but if at some point we would be able to see the nature seen by the Buddha exactly as he did, then what the Buddha saw and what we would see would be exactly the same. So it's a truth for all sentient beings. It's not like a truth only for the Buddha, or not only a truth for noble people, for noble beings. Likewise, that truth of the nature of things is something that can be shown to to everyone. It's not a question of whether all sense should be able to, it's only a question of whether people are able to realize it or not, or understand it or not. But there's the nature is something that can be realized by all sentient beings, and it's not something that we need to keep secret or hide from anyone. Or to explain it from another perspective, when the Buddha saw the nature of all phenomena, the nature of the Dharma, that nature that he saw, the Dharma that he saw, is like permeates the entire world. It's like all pervasive. It's not just like a truth for the Buddha alone. It's not that something that only the Buddha gets to see and no one else can. If we get to that level ourselves, we can all see it too. And so for this reason, it's an all pervasive, it's a universal truth. The truth that is explained in the Dharmas is to be explained to be like this. So it's a universal, all pervasive truth. And it is true in all worlds, whether you're a noble individual or an ordinary individual, the actual nature, whatever it is exactly, it stays the same. It's not like that it's true when Buddha see it and false when ordinary individuals like it. The truth always remains true. And so there's nothing to keep secret, or there's not something that needs to be distinguished for different individuals. It's not something that only appeared to the Buddha that won't appear to anyone else. It's just that the Buddha himself saw it, but actually it's not that the Buddha only saw it, there's nothing else. It's not like that. It's actually a universal truth. Or another way of looking about it, or looking at it, is that the Dharma is something we can realize, whether the nature of the phenomena, the nature of all phenomena is something that we can realize, it's something we can manifest. And for this reason, the Dharma of early Buddhism is a religion that can be understood and known rationally. It teaches that it's something that a Buddha realizes through his wisdom and prajna. It's not said to be that a religion that must be realized on the basis of mere faith. It's not that the Buddha said you can achieve it through faith alone. It's something that you need it's not something that you can only realize through faith alone. You also need to use your intelligence and your prajna. So when you talk about the Dharma that the Buddha realized, the Buddha that the Dharma manifest, must be realized through prajna. So the clear realization must come through knowing the nature through prajna. And so within the teachings of early Buddhism, when we talk about the Four Truths, the 12 links, the 5 aggregates, and the 4 views office, and all these other foundational views, all of these are about ways that we need to seek out the nature through prajna. And when it's teaching about many presentations of Dharma and many philosophical presentations, these are saying that we need to examine nature, look for the nature through our prajna. And we need to come to know the nature of things on the basis of prajna. And so for this reason, in early Buddhism, the Dharma that the Buddha clearly realized uh, is not connected to blind faith or with no rational basis or confused faith. It's like, as I mentioned just before, it's like lighting a light. It's like lighting a light in the darkness. It's like this luminous nature, and it has like the nature of clearly knowing and clearly being aware. And so that's the general explanation, right? However, but if we look at the specific explanations, so the general explanation is, as I said, but if you actually look at it in a matter of fact, the Buddha's awakening or the Buddha's clear awareness of Dharma is not solely related on, it was based on logic or awareness on prajna. Of course, it did depend upon prajna, upon reasons and logic, but it's not solely based upon that. The example is, as is emphasized in the Mahayana, what it says is the Buddha's enlightenment or the Dharma the Buddha clearly realized is beyond words. It is inconceivable. It's not something we can say, it is this. It's not something that we can explain. And so this is really emphasized in the Mahayana teachings. Similarly, this is also found in the scriptures of early Buddhism. And the way this is that please wait a moment. And the reason why it said this is it said in the Sutra of Brahma's Net, the Brahmadala Sutra. So as I said the other day, it is in the long discourses of the Pali scriptures. And so as we said, there are the five Nikayas, and among them there's the long discourses. And the first of these is the Sutra of Brahma's Net. What it says in the sutra is, as bhikkhus, it is only to trifling and insignificant matters, to the minor details of mere moral virtue that a worldling would refer to when speaking in praise of a Tathagata. So it goes on for quite a bit. And what it's saying is that when worldly people are praising the Buddha, so speaking in praise of the Buddha, so they're saying nice things about the Buddha in brief. This is basically praising or celebrating the Buddha, the Tathagata. They'd say, oh, the Buddha really keeps very good discipline, and he practices the 10 virtues and so forth. And so these are the things that they praise the Buddha for. But really, for the Buddha to keep discipline and accomplish virtue is actually kind of insignificant. They're really not so important. They're just basically the Buddha's daily activities, but they're not the vast activities or vast deeds of a Buddha. That isn't the most significant activity of a Buddha. And so then it continues. What it says is, bhikkhus, there are other dharmas deep, difficult to see, difficult to understand, peaceful and sublime, beyond the sphere of reasoning, subtle, comprehensible only to the wise, which the Tathagata, having realized for himself with direct knowledge, propounds to others, and it is concerning these that those who would rightly praise the Tathagata in accordance with reality would speak. And so it continues saying much else about this. And so what this is actually saying is, as the most ordinary worldly people think, oh, the Buddha is important, we go for refuge. We go for refuge is really important. And so if you want to praise the Buddha, then what are you going to praise the Buddha? What they offer, what they praise is the Buddha really has excellent discipline. The Buddha doesn't lie, the Buddha doesn't kill. And so in this way, they praise the Buddha for keeping the 10 virtues and so forth. And so the Buddha is excellent, this is wonderful, and we praise him for this. But actually, when you think about for the Buddha, these are actually really small qualities. These are actually small deeds. They aren't his greatest deeds and activity. They aren't the most significant and important quality of his activity. In actuality, if you really wanted to praise the Buddha, if you wanted to offer really vast praise of the Buddha, what you would praise is the Dharma that the Buddha realized clearly, or that he manifested. You'd speak about the qualities of realization in the Buddha's meaning. These are what we would have to praise. We'd have to speak about the qualities of abandonment and realization, in particular, the extremely profound qualities of realization that are deep, difficult to see, and difficult to understand, peaceful, sublime, beyond the sphere of reasoning. And so that the scholars at that time, of course, when you say scholars or people, that's very similar. When you talk about scholars at that time, are actually people who were really skilled in the meaning, something that only the wise could realize, something that this is what the Buddha realized, what he was able to realize. And so this is like the amazing, completely perfect quality that if we could praise this, then that would be a praise that really hits the mark. It is praising what is actually worthy of being praised. But ordinary individuals, and most ordinary individuals, don't know how to make such praises. In any case, at that time, in the Sutra of the Brahma's Net, it says that the Buddha, that the Tathagata realized, when you're speaking about the nature of it, you think about the qualities of this is difficult to see, difficult to know, peaceful, subtle, and beyond the sphere of reasoning. And so here, when we say reasoning, and so in Pali, this is the word is taka, or in tarka is in Sanskrit. So sometimes we talk about the 5 groups of tarkas in the Tibetan tradition, which would mean we're talking about the 5 different schools of the tarkas, or that. So these are the same. So the same word. The word is tarka in Sanskrit. It's someone who's examining things logically, and you spending all their time considering things logically and reasoning. So here, this is not beyond the sphere of reasoning. The actual original world is actually tarka or taka in Pali. In other words, this is all only using logical analysis and logical reasoning. So describe it in another way, the realization of a Buddha, this clear realization, transcends the sphere of reasoning or the sphere of logicians. And so it cannot be understood from speaking about it and using logic. It's not something you can understand by just speaking about it or reasoning. So this is why it said that it's difficult to know and difficult to see. Likewise, in this passage, it says that the Buddha realized for himself with direct realization. with direct realization, it says. So this word, if I can show it to you, says the Tathagata, having realized for himself with direct knowledge, it says. You say the Buddha having realized for himself with direct knowledge. Here the word for realization is in Pali is abhijna in Pali. And so in Pali it's abhijna. So in Sanskrit it's abhigyan. We're going to talk about abhigya in Sanskrit means clearly knowing or manifesting knowing, clearly realizing or manifestly knowing. So knowing something really clearly. So clearly knowing means knowing something really, really clearly. And so at that, in this passage, the abhijnana means not only knows it, but it also includes the meaning of clairvoyances. For example, the clairvoyances of miracles, the divine eye, and so forth. The 6 clairvoyances that we teach about. And so the word for the clairvoyances is also abhijna. So in Pali, it's the same word, abhijna. And such clairvoyances, when we say that Tathagata realized for himself, these clairvoyances have the property of being secret or profound. So secret means like hidden. It's something that ordinary people are unable to know. So it's like this, the hidden or secret wisdom, that's like this property or this characteristic. And so for this reason, they're beyond the sphere of reasoning. Or in still other words, the Buddha's awakening or the Buddha's realization, clear realization, can only be manifested through the profound or secret wisdom. And so for this reason, the dharma that the Buddha realized is difficult for ordinary people to know, difficult to see, and beyond the sphere of reasoning. Because ordinary people cannot realize it, the realization of the Buddha has that hidden or secret religion, or secret nature. That's why these different words are added. So in actuality, it's quite possible that they had it, but actually with the Buddha itself, its nature itself, and its nature has the profound and secret qualities. And the way that we know this is we talk about the clear realization of the Buddha, when we talk about the enlightenment of the Buddha, which is clear realization, the word for the clear realization is sometimes they use the word vidya or awareness. And so it's vidya. So vidya in Sanskrit, so it's vidya in Sanskrit and vijja in Pali. So vijja in Pali and vidya in Sanskrit. So this word vidya, so this word vidya is also used for the clear realization of a Buddha. And so how we know this is in this. As in the guy recited this quote before, right? It said, of the star never heard before, vision arises, wisdom arises, prajna arises, awareness arises, and light arises. So it says awareness arises. It says the word awareness, and that awareness is vidya or vijja. So in the Indian language, it's a vidya or vijja. So when you say vidya or vijja or awareness, can also be understood to mean like knowledge or science. Sometimes it means an area of knowledge. It seems like a field of knowledge that we study. We can talk about the 10 areas of knowledge or the 5 areas of knowledge. Not only that, this word vidya or awareness also means awareness mantras. When you talk about secret mantras, awareness mantras, and dharani mantras. This here, the vidya means awareness mantras. For example, the word when it's used in the secret mantra is often translated as awareness mantras or rikna in Tibetan. So awareness mantras. And this isn't only in the mantra within the Vinaya and the texts of the Theravada school. There are many passages where the word vidya is used in the sense of awareness mantras or spells or charms. So when you talk about the wisdom of clear realization or the wisdom of clear knowing, one quality that it must have is it has like an amazing nature or a secret or a hidden nature, or it has secret or a certain secret or hidden meaning. Because it's said that many passages where it says that it's not that ordinary people aren't to realize it, and so it definitely must have such a meaning. However, within the scriptures of early Buddhism, when you talk about the realization, the wisdom of clear realization, it's actually very complicated. And the reason why it's so complicated is that there are actually kind of two different ways to look at it. In the early Buddhism, for one perspective, vidya means something that's logical and based on reasons, and it's luminous prajna. That it's, but then in another perspective, how do we say it? It's like not a. It's like a nature that's not hidden. So it's a nature that's not hidden. It's something that we can know through logic and reasons. From another perspective, it's something that something that can't be realized through realizing. So on one hand, it seems like something you can realize through logic and reasoning. From another reason, it seems like you can't do it. It's not something you can know entirely through reasons and evidence. And so it's explained in these two ways. So for this reason, you cannot say that within the scriptures of Buddhism that there is no room for it to be a calmness of the awareness, wisdom, and the secret. I mean, it's not that you can't, because both of these explanations happen and appear in the scriptures of early Buddhism. And so maybe we talk about the jnana or the awareness, wisdom of the sentient being, it's something that can be achieved through reasons and logic, and the other aspect is something that can't be realized through logic and realizing. So definitely within the teachings of early Buddhism, this vidya can also be it is also imbued with a meaning of being secret or hidden. So you cannot say that vidya is solely related to the logic and reasoning and so forth, that it's only speaking about something that you have to go through logic and realizing. It's not like that. It's difficult for ordinary individuals, and it's hidden to them. And it is secret from them. That's because it is also explained. It is also explained with this meaning as well. However, what some people say is that in the Sutra of Brahma's Net, what it says is that the secret mantra that is based on superstition. So at that time, there was a lot of superstition. There are many different rituals that you do, and those are very widespread in India. And so, and also irrational divinations and astrology. And so there are very strong prohibitions of them against that in the Sutra of Brahma's Net. And so for this reason, there's no connection at all between the Buddha's wisdom or awareness and the secret mantra, because within the Sutra of Brahma's Net itself, it clearly prohibits the practice of superstitious mantras and divinations and so forth. It's very clearly prohibited in the sutra. And so if we say this, there is something that we need to consider there. From one perspective, what is said in the Sutra of Brahma's Net, there is a clear rejection of superstitious mantras and irrational mantras in astrology. So that is true. But within the four agamas, there is discussion of protection mantras, words, and forth, and so forth. And so it's important for us to understand this. And so actually, I will speak about this later. I do not need, I won't speak about them today. In any case, during the Buddha's lifetime, among the public, generally many people of that time became Buddhist, went for refuge to the Buddha. They believed the Buddha. They studied Buddhism and practiced it. There were quite a few people, but most of these people were, or you could say they're ignorant or deluded, and they didn't have a lot of education. And of course, at that time, there was no education. These days, most countries have give all sentient beings, all people the opportunity to receive education. They have schools for people to go to, but at that time in India, there was no widespread tradition of giving people the opportunity for education. There are only a few people in the higher realms, in the higher castes, who had the opportunity to get an education. The people in lower realms had lower castes had no even opportunity to even get any education or to learn how to read. And so there are people who had no education, no project, no diligence, and so forth. And so for that reason, there were probably were not very many people who had the opportunity to practice the Dharma that Buddha taught properly. And so for this reason, within Buddhism at that time, there are many people who continued to follow this superstitions. So even among Buddhists of that time, just as there were among the people, if there are people, there'd be, even there were some who had met the Buddha, who became Buddhist and followed his teachings, but there would also more than a few who were superstitious. And so for this reason, some scholars say that within early Buddhism, that for practices of the Buddhism, there must have been two different levels or paths. There's one for those who followed logic, the people who didn't follow superstition, who really thought about the reasons, who investigated the nature. So there's one group of people who did that. And there's also, there must have been a set of people who primarily followed cessation. So these two different groups of disciples. And it similarly says this in the Great Exposition. So what it says in the Great Exposition of the Vaibhashika school, this is a famous text of the Sarvastivada school. It's an Abhidharma text. So what it says here is that when we're speaking about the 8 branches of the Noble Path, it teaches about right speech and right livelihoods, but it also speaks about right action and right speech. So actually, the right livelihood would be it would be included within right speech and right action. So right action includes the action that we do. So the right livelihood should be included in that, but it's separated out separately. So what is the reason why right livelihood is explained separately? And one reason is that wrong livelihoods are very difficult to give up. And eliminating them is very difficult. And so for this reason, right livelihood is explained separately as a separate category within the eight branches of the Noble Path. Now, the reason why wrong livelihood is so difficult to purify or difficult to abandon so this is described in the Great Exposition. Oh, I was unable to make this one, but there's no problem. Probably it's fine to just give the main meaning. The main point here is that wrong livelihood is difficult to abandon, different to purifical. The reason why is that in the world, there are two dharmas, or two things that are difficult to purify and difficult to give up. So there are these two dharmas, and so what are they? For householders, the wrong view is difficult to purify or difficult to abandon. And for monastics, the wrong livelihood is difficult to purify and abandon. The reason for this is that when we speak about it's difficult for householders to give up the wrong views, and so it's very difficult for householders to give up wrong views. And the reason for this is you have like a lay practitioner who has the five precepts, a very wise one, and who knows a fair amount about the Buddha's Dharma, and who has properly taken the five precepts and who keeps them. But even someone like that, if they have some difficulty, so one day they have a difficulty, like they get sick or they have physical illness, or there's some difficulty in the household, or their business doesn't go well, or if they have some other similar sort of difficulty that's part of it, then immediately run off to worldly duty. They go to God, that some deity of a tree deity or a shrine deity or so forth, and they bring some milk and they immediately go and they make an offering to that and they recite some supplications. And because their minds are uncomfortable, they feel uncomfortable. Even because he's someone who practices the Dharma, by practicing the Dharma, you should actually just feel comfortable. You should be able to do this. I say, I've got no problem. I've gone to refuge to the Buddha. I should be fine. I should have some conviction and some bitterness, but they don't have that. And a little bit of a difficulty comes up, they should think, oh, I need to do something. And they immediately run off and they bring their incense, flowers, and milk and so forth. And something you take, as in this is the Indian tradition, you take your incense and flowers and you go to the Shiva Linga. And so you go to like pour the milk over the Shiva Linga and immediately do this. And then they feel comfortable because they don't believe in karmic cause and effect. Because if you don't believe in karmic cause and effect, there's no need to do that. But because they don't believe deeply in karmic cause and effect, when they meet a difficulty, then their true nature shines through. Now, with the monastics, the way it happens, if you have like a wise monastic who has the full ordination, has a picture of bhikshuni, it really keeps their discipline well. Even someone like that. So at that time, the livelihood for the bhikshus depended upon others. So something you had to depend on others because you had to go and beg for your alms. It wasn't like we do where you immediately get food wherever you want. If you don't need to go anywhere and beg and you just eat the monastery's food, the old day in India it wasn't like that. In any case, every day you had to go out to beg for your food. And the best, if you got it, was best, and if you didn't get any, you had nothing to do. You had to just be, stay hungry. And because your livelihood depended upon others, then when you'd see a patron, then you'd sort of like to, even if you weren't normally all that well, you didn't have a good posture, you'd sort of stand up, you'd sort of try to look good, you'd speak nicely, and be really nice to the patron, and be very caring to them, you'd take great interest in them. So wishing in order to get food, to get what you need for your livelihood, you would show a really, could put on a very nice airs. But this is actually a wrong livelihood, actually. As it said, that you can't flatter or praise people for them. So in the actual, if someone you give if like, so this means like, a patron once gave you something, and if you need to say, oh, please give me another one, but you aren't able to ask that yourself, but in order to do that, the way to get that is you do think that in the past you gave me this thing, and it was really helpful. It was really good. I used it a lot. At that time, he would say, and it was like something that I really needed at that time. And so you speak like this, and what you're saying implicitly, in the past you said, give me what you gave me before, is what you're saying implicitly. For monastics, that for giving up a wrong livelihood is really difficult. Giving up a wrong livelihood and practicing a right livelihood is very difficult because your livelihood depends on others. And so it's difficult to give up flattering and buttering up your patrons. And so, for the monastics, for uh, uh, for for a household, it's very difficult to give up the wrong view and to develop the correct worldly view and believe in karmic cause and effect and rituals and so forth. So that's now. So we will take a break now. So now we will have a 30-minute intermission.
说到下面啊，أنا رجع ساعتي قاعد لها بشيء في عرب توصي.
Now I'd like to explain the term awareness mantras. Let me speak about awareness mantras. First of all, in the scriptures of early Buddhism, we need to speak about the awareness mantras that were prohibited in early Buddhism. Now, in the Pali five Nikayas, or five sets of discourses, there are what are called the long discourses. And the first sutra in the long discourses is the Sutra of Brahma's Net. And in this Sutra of Brahma's Net, there are many prohibitions of many awareness mantras saying that you are not allowed to practice them. So I would like to speak about this. Now, as I mentioned above, the word used in the Sanskrit word, or the Pali word, in Sanskrit it's vidya, and in Pali it's vidya. And if we translate it into English, it is awareness, or in Tibetan, rigpa. So when we talk about what is awareness, or rigpa, in ancient days, the way they understood vidya as like miraculous awareness mantras or spells. It is something that has a particular power, and because of this, they called it as the miraculous awareness or amazing mantras. There are many rituals using the pacifying, expanding, magnetizing, and destroying mantras. And so the awareness mantras mean these amazing awareness mantras. And at the time, the awareness mantras, if we think about it, are actually similar to our present-day science. Because the reason why we say that they're similar to science is that they had a certain cause that produces a certain result. Like in science today, how should we say this? I have to say it very simply in terms of the scientific way of doing things. I'm not sure if I should be science, but if you join hydrogen and oxygen, then you can get water. It's like they're similar to that. You have a certain causes, it produces a certain result that is it definitely going to produce that certain result. And so for that reason, we have great confidence in science. It says if you have the results and they're all present, if you have the causes, they're all present, then it's definitely going to produce that result. And so for that, when science describes this, we believe in science. And it seems like awareness mantras also have this sort of power. If you do the awareness mantra, if you do this, then it produces some sort of a power or capacity. And so in this way, the awareness mantras are similar, of that time, are similar to the science of today. And so for that reason, when we say this word vidya, within the vidya that's used in the scriptures of early Buddhism, is basically two different aspects. You can divide it into two. And the first is the awareness that the Buddha accepted. It's the awareness that the Buddha would explain. And there's also the vidya that the Buddha did not accept. It is. So in other words, you can say that there's the vidya that he accepted and the vidya that he did not accept. For example, the vidya that he accepted was when in the Buddha's words, when he calls the ultimate wisdom by the word awareness. That such of awareness, that sort of vidya is something that the Buddha accepted. And so in early Buddhism, we say that it is said that this is the type of awareness or vidya that the Buddha accepted. The vidya that he did not accept, and that more than just that, he also prohibited, includes the different vidyas or awareness mantras that appear in the Sutra Brahma's Net. So these are all included in the second type. They're also included the vidya or the sorts of awareness mantras that the Buddha did not accept. So this is the type of awareness that the Buddha, or vidya, that the Buddha prohibited. And so in the Sutra of Brahma's Intent, this is what are called the debased awareness, debased vidya, or arts.
음,
So it is Tirachana Vidya. Not sure how to pronounce that. Tirachana Vidya. So it means the debased arts or the pointless arts. Sometimes it's translated as useless or debased arts, and sometimes it's translated as animal arts, so that animal rikpa. So tirachana also means animals, and because it can also mean animal. These debased vidya is also translated as the animal. Is it in the Chinese scriptures? It's primarily translated as animal, animal awareness mantras. In any case, this Sutra of Brahma's net, and also in the Sutra of the results of the spiritual way of the path, both include these prohibitions of debased vidya mantras. To give you an example of this from the Sutra in of Brahma's net. And what it says in the Sutra of Brahma's net, what it says is that it speaks about prophesying long life, prosperity, or the reverse from the marks on a person's limbs, hands, or feet. This is basically like reading palms, as people do. They look at your palms and they examine what's going to happen in your life. And also means of omen, but means of omens and signs, which basically means this means basically in Chinese it translated suspicion, making augurs in the midst of thunderbolts and celestial portents, interpreting ominous dreams, or like telling fortune marks on the body, such as in the old times when the Buddha was born, and there were soothsayers who came and who looked at the marks of his body. And so as soon as he was born, when they saw his body, said in his future he will either become a universal emperor or he will become a Buddha. And they made this prediction. So there's like telling fortunes from the various marks or features on the body. And also they're making auguries from the marks on cloth, not by rice. So the mice would chew through cloth, and you'd look the patterns of those and make auguries from that. Or offering fire oblations, making fire sacrifices, making oblations from a navel. So basically here, like we have the different types of labels, the filling ladle and the offering ladle. So this here was meant here. So offerings, oblations of husks, rice powder, rice grains, ghee. So basically these are different types of offerings and so forth. There's something in here I need to change. So there are oblations of husks, oblations of rice powder and ghee, and also oil, oblations from the mouth. I'm not sure what that means. Then offerings of blood sacrifices, making predictions based on the fingertips, and determining the site for a proposed house or garden is propitious or not. So it's basically sort of like feng shui. It's kind of similar to our present day feng shui. It's called feng shui in Chinese. Making predictions for the officers of state. So these are making the predictions that you need to make for politicians. The knowledge of charms to lay demons in a cemetery and so forth is either the sorts of charms that you need to deal with demons. The knowledge of charms to cure those ones possessed by ghosts. So this is when people are possessed, then the charms you need for that. the snakecraft, the crafts, charms of trust, the charms for poison, the charms for scorpions. So these are probably poisonous aquatic scorpions, and then the rat charms, and then charms for birds, and then charms for crows. And then there's also for telling the number of years the person has to live. So it's saying that the way of predicting the number of years someone has left to live. And then the knowledge of charms to give protection from arrows. So in the old days, they used arrows and spears and swords and so forth. So if you're struck by an arrow, there were charms for not charms or vidyas to prepare from that. And then also charms to understand the language of animals. And so these are ways to examine that. So forth. These are the sorts of vidyas or awareness mantras that were prohibited. So in the Sutra Brahma's Net, it lists many different types of awareness mantras. You could say they're mantras or sciences or areas of knowledge, and these are all prohibited. In brief, basically, when you say the debased arts or the animal arts, what this includes are palmistry, or reading palms, or examining dreams, looking at the various different types of omens and auguries. Then the second type is the fire sacrifices of ghee and so forth, the different types of fire offerings. And then also doing charms or craft for homes or charms for craft the various knowledge and so forth about snakes, boats, and so forth. And then also the protection that are related to war and battle, and to give protection during this. So these are also overcome. There are also many others, and I don't need to recite them all. So what it says after that, there's the knowledge of how to make weapons and possessions, the evaluation of men and women, so the knowledge, so the science of men, science of women, also the science of animals. Also, there's many knowledge and areas of knowledge and awareness about knowledge about military activities. And there's the examination of when there'll be eclipses of the sun and the moon, also examination of stars, also the different types of activities or areas of knowledge about reconciling people, or astrology, or politics, or the many areas of knowledge for ordinary lineage, and even including medical treatments. As I said, that these are all the pointless areas of knowledge, the pointless or debased arts. And so they're basically all included as things to be prohibited. And so what we can understand from this is that the awareness in the Sutra of Brahma's Knot doesn't just mean only spells and awareness spells. But when we talk about awareness, or it means that it can also include medical treatment. For example, studying the medical arts. It talks about many of the worldly areas of knowledge are also included here in this. And thus, along with the prohibiting awareness mantras and spells, it also prohibits many different areas of worldly knowledge and different ways of various different types of world predictions and so forth. These are all prohibited. So the vidya here, one thing we need to understand, we talk about vidya here, or awareness here, the knowledge here, it means knowledge or sciences or the arts. For example, when the Mahayana teaching spread, as Buddhism developed and Mahayana teaching spread, what it says in the Mahayana Sutras is that bodhisattvas must study the 5 sciences or the 5 areas of knowledge. And I often quote this, right? The quote from by Maitreya, right? where it says you must train in the 5 sciences, the 5 awarenesses. And so I often quote this, right? And so the bodhisattvas must study the 5 sciences. And so but these 5 sciences are all prohibited in the Sutra Brahma's net. So these vidya, or the awareness module that's but here it talks about the arts and the sciences. So this is also not just in the Sutra of Brahma's net, but it's also in many different parts. Also prohibited in different parts of the Vinaya. For example, in the Pali Vinaya, they're primarily the 3 different main parts. The first is the Vibhanga, or the points of chapter, and the third is the aggregate, so the chapter, and the last is the appendix. And the second part, in terms of the middle session, in terms of the Tibetan, this includes what are called the Vinaya Vastu, the chapters on discipline, or the finer points of discipline. And so this has different 22 different sections in the Pali. So in the Tibetan tradition, the chapters on discipline have 7 different chapters. So here there are 22 different sections. And these are divided into 2 parts, the major and the minor. And so this is on the minor's point. And so this minor, or Kuddhavatu. And so this is talking about the Gang of 6. And the Gang of 6 means that among the bhikshus, there were many of the precepts for the bhikshus was made because of all the various different things that the members of the Gang of 6 did. So here at this point, when talking about whether to study the debased arts, the debased sciences or not, it all happened because of the studies of the Gang of 6. They studied these pointless fields of knowledge, and because of that, the Buddha told the Gaudiya that you may not study these pointless sciences, and if you do, it would be an infraction. And so that's one thing that said. And then the Gang of 6 started to teach these animal sciences, or debased areas of sciences, to others. And then the Bhikshu then said that they may not teach the debased, or the pointless sciences or debased sciences to others, and if they did, that it'd be an infraction. And so this is in the Khuddakavatu of the Pali canon. And so this is similar to the finer points of discipline in the Tibetan canon. And so, for example, usually we talk about the precepts spoken about in the chapters on discipline. The finer points of discipline are primarily precepts about things we need to do, whereas the precept in the Pratimoksha and so forth are the prohibitions. That's an important point to understand. Now, in the 5-part Vinaya of the Mahishashaka school, the bhikshus learned spells that would incapacitate others. And it said that you may not so the Buddha prohibited it. So if you kind of make people so that just kind of confused them. And so there are these spells that would do this. And so some bhikshus learned these, and because they studied them, the Buddha then prohibited them studying. And said if they studied this, would be an infraction, it would be a problem. Likewise, in the 5-part Vinaya, the Mahishasaka school, it also says the Buddhas were studying mantras to raise the dead. So there must have been some sort of a science or a mantra for raising the dead after someone's passed away. You must not learn them. And if you do, and then there's an infraction. And so there are many other such instances where the bhikshus were said that it's not okay for the bhikshus to study these areas of knowledge or awareness, uh, and that it be. So there are many such passages teaching this, but among the 250 precepts of a bhikshu, there are none about learning these pointless feeds of knowledge or the animal areas of knowledge. So within the 250 precepts, this just doesn't appear. And there's no prohibition against learning the pointless or the animal arts. But for the bhikshunis, they're saying if they learn the debased arts or the debased areas of knowledge or the animal areas of knowledge, there are precepts against saying that not only is it not okay, but there's actual precept prohibiting it. And the way we can know this is that in the Pali Bhikkhuni Vibhanga, there are the downfalls for the bhikkhunis. And so the downfalls are one category of the precepts, right? So the 49th of the downfalls is related to this. And what it says here is that the gang of 6 nuns. So in the Vibhanga, there's a gang of 6 nuns. Now, in the Tibetan translations of the Vinaya texts, we talk about the bhikshus having a gang of 6, but for the bhikkhunis, there's no gang of 6. For the bhikkhunis, for the bhikshus, they're the gang of 6 who did all sorts of who behaved badly and did all sorts of different things. It's like a group of them or a gang of them. So there are few of them. There are 6 of them. They're called the gang of 6 because there are 6 of them. And there was in the places that there were 12. There's the gang of 12, and there are the bhikshunis who behaved badly and did all the different things. So we talk about the gang of 12, the bhikshunis. There was no gang of 6 in the Tibetan, but in the Pali there is a gang of 6 for the bhikshunis as well. So the gang of 6 bhikkhunis also studied the debased arts of the animal arts, and because of this, they were criticized by lay people. And as for the Buddha learned of this, and he said, from now on, you may not study these animal arts or debased arts. And so this is the 49th of the downfalls in the Pali Bhikkhuni Vibhanga. And then likewise, the 50th downfall prohibits teaching the useless knowledge to others. So that's how it is. And so for that reason, it's actually prohibited and included as a precept. Similarly, in the Vinayas translated into Chinese, there are also similar passages for the bhikshunis. To give one example, in the Dharmaguptaka 4 divisions of the Vinaya, in the 4-part Vinaya of the Dharmaguptaka school, so it's in the 4-part Vinaya of the Dharmaguptaka. So that's again speaking about the gang of 6 nuns. And so the gang of 6 nuns studied various different areas of knowledge. So they studied basically primarily the awareness mantras. They learned many of them. When the bhikshunis heard about this, and among the bhikshunis, there are quite a few who were content and had few desires. So there's some good bhikshunis, and these bhikshunis admonished the gang of 6 nuns, and that said, why do you need to study these awareness mantras and fears of knowledge? Why are you studying them? They criticized them and they reprimanded them. And when they did, then the bhikkhunis reported this to the Buddha. And the Buddha then reprimanded the gang of 6 nuns, saying that these such behaviors are not in accordance with the spiritual way. That if the nun would study such worldly knowledge, or if you can say these pointless areas of knowledge, then it is a downfall. So this is what is said in the Dharmakatha. Likewise, also in the Patimokkha of the Dharmakatha Vinaya, it says if the bhikkhuni studies it from a layperson, then that is a downfall. If they teach the debased arts to someone, to a layperson, then it is a downfall. Likewise, in the Bhikkhuni Vinaya, the Sarvastivada school, it also describes the prohibitions of various different types of awareness mantras. Similarly, in the Mahasanghaka school, it says that if they should learn as the awareness mantras from another or teach it to another, it is a downfall. And then there's also the Bhikkhuni Vinaya of the Mulasarvastivada school that is in Tibetan. Now there are 180 of these, 180 in the downfalls and that are for the bhikshunis. And of these 180, there are 72 that are common to the bhikshus and the bhikshunis, but there are some particular ones for the bhikshuni. And so there are 108 of these. And among these, the 34th is, I believe it's the 34th. What it says in the 34th is, if you learn a mantra from a householder, it is a downfall. If you study the awareness, and here we mean the awareness mantras. And the story behind this is that Tulananda. And Tulananda was one of the badly behaved nuns. And she went to study a magical spell from a layperson. And then because of this, this rule was made. The way it became a downfall is that if a bhikshuna learns even a little bit of awareness mantra from a layperson, then it is a downfall. If even as a short mantra, that is even learning even a short mantra is prohibited. Similarly, within the Tibetan Mulasarvastivada Vinaya, the 35th of the particular downfalls for the bhikshunis is if you make a householder read it is a downfall. So if you learn one from them, then it's an if. So if you make a householder read one, then it's an if. And if it's Tulananda, so it's Tulananda, the same nun, it's the same bhikshuni. And when she was in the area of Shravasti, there was a man. So a householder, a man, whom she made read oh, householder, please read Siripu, Bisipiripu, Siribi, Siripu Soha, she said it. She made him read it. So you memorize that, she said. And then he recited it. And she taught it to him twice, 2 and 3 times. When you talk about giving like when you're learning transmissions, you have to recite it over and over again, 2 or 3 times until they said you have to recite it over and over. So recite it. So Siripu, then he said Bisiripu. In any case, you have to recite. And you have to recite it, repeat it several times until they memorize it. So 2 or 3 times. And that person said, "Oh, noble one, I've memorized it completely. I really memorized it poorly. So you don't need to say it again. You don't need to worry about it, he said. And then Tulananda said to him, "Oh, that's enough. You got stuff to keep. Just keep repeating it." She made him recite it over and over again. And then at a certain point, that person got angry and he said, I've already completely memorized it, so you're still making me. And so he got angry about it. And he said, you, he said, and so let me say that I don't need this spell. He said, I'm not going to study this. I'm stopping. That's enough for me, he said. And then he went off. And that time there was another bhikkhuni who was with a bhikkhuni, because when bhikkhunis went out there, someone who wanted they really weren't allowed to go out alone. And so there was a bhikkhuni who was accompanying them at that time. This bhikkhuni said to Tulananda, "Noble one, why are you annoying everyone so much? So why are you doing that to make us?" And so then Tulananda said, "I said, it's not a problem." He's saying, "Oh, what the thing he said is no problem. He's just words. It's nothing, not important. There's no problem." So she just completely ignored it, right? And so it's just because then the bhikkhuni who was with Tulananda then got completely surprised and said, "Then you're someone who does get angry. No matter how badly that person speaks about you, then you never get angry. But you don't feel any afflictions. It's really amazing," she said. And praised Tulananda about this. And when later the bhikshunis asked the Bhagavan about this, and they asked the Buddha, and what the Buddha said was, and the Buddha made the precept and said, you're not allowed to teach the awareness mantras to others. You're not allowed to make them recite them. In any case, the main point is, as I said before, if you think about the way it's described in the different scriptures, the different schools, and in the early Buddhism, there were the pointless arts, the pointless areas. And it's very clear that this is very clearly prohibited. And so for this reason, within early Buddhism, you say awareness, or vidya, or in Sanskrit, vidya, is probably something used in a negative sense as something to be prohibited. This is more frequently in that context. So in general, occasionally vidya is sometimes used as something that the Buddha accepted, but most circumstances they're more frequently used in the sense of something to be prohibited. For example, in the word for ignorance in early Buddhism, avidya, avidya. So awareness is vidya, and ignorance is avidya, or in Pali, avidya. So the awareness that is the opposite of ignorance is called enlightenment. Likewise, in the Dhammaguptaka Vinaya, the four-part Vinaya, there are also descriptions of ignorance ceasing and awareness arising. And these are like descriptions of what it's like to achieve enlightenment, to achieve the state of a Buddha. So there are a few such passages, but there are only a very few such instances. Mostly, when describing the realization or awakening of a Buddha, the words that they use are panya for prajna, panya or prajna, or they talk about perfect enlightenment, sambodhi. So they use these sorts of words to illustrate or to describe enlightenment. And when we talk about the speaking about complete perfect Buddhahood or perfect enlightenment, they use words such as prajna or enlightenment, prajna or sambodhi. These words more frequently, but that word vidya is not used very frequently. However, if we think about it from another perspective, we approach it from another direction. The word for awareness in early Buddhism, and so vidya or vidya that I've mentioned earlier, is used only a few times. So prajna and enlightenment or even awakening are used for it, and the word awareness is used less frequently. So it's used less and numerically. However, within these words of text of early Buddhism, the use of the word vidya for enlightenment is very clear. And how do we know that it's used? Is, as I mentioned much before, I've given many examples. And so, in addition to give another example, for example, the Buddha has many different names. The Tathagata, the completely perfect Buddha, and so forth. So in the Chinese tradition, we talk about the 10 epithets. So within the Buddhahood, that's not, we don't use that term so much, the 10 names of the Buddha. And these are all the names such as the wonder, the awareness, and contact. These are all different epithets for the Buddha. In any case, among the 10 epithets for the Buddha, one of them is the one with awareness and conduct. And we say the one with awareness and conduct, the word for awareness is vidya. It's that word vidya itself. This is either vidya or vidya awareness. In particular, moreover, when we talk about the clairvoyances of a Buddha, remembering his past lives, the clairvoyance of the divine, the clairvoyance of knowing the extinction of defilements, these three clairvoyances are called the three awarenesses. They're called three awarenesses. And in this context, the word in the original language is, again, vidya. It's that same word. And so if we think about this point, then the awareness and the three awarenesses and clairvoyance, clairvoyant, the word clairvoyance are basically is synonymous. It's basically the word for the same thing. And so the awareness or vidya in the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya actually also does include some of the qualities or properties of awareness mantra. I think it is reasonable to say this. And because of this, later, during the time of the Mahayana, when the Mahayana was falling, when the sutras, if a sutra was said to have the nature of an awareness mantra, then at that point they used the word awareness. For example, in our Heart Sutra, it reads the mantra of transcendent prajna, the mantra of great awareness, the best mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that pacifies all suffering, right? And so here, when this is the mantra of great awareness, or you could also turn this as the great awareness mantra, great awareness mantra, you could also say the great awareness mantra or the mantra of great awareness. Here, the Mahavidya, that vidya, is of course awareness itself. Not only is it awareness, that vidya and mantra are combined. They're joined to each other to become vidya mantra or awareness mantras. Moreover, the transcendent prajna itself is also said to be a great awareness mantra. If someone recites it and memorizes it, they're said to be able to dispel all suffering instead. Likewise, also in the 8,000 lines sutra, so in Tibet. So this is a sutra. It's not exactly, this is a Chinese sutra. It's not exactly the same as the Prajnaparamita Sutra in 8,000 lines, but it's basically the same. And third, there's the third chapter on stupas and the fourth chapter on awareness mantras. And what they say is that Prajnaparamita itself is a great awareness mantra. This is said many times. Not only that, it says that memorizing even a single phrase or line from the Prajnaparamita Sutras has the benefit of preventing harm from poisonous snakes. Says that if it says that if you recite the mantra, it'll prevent that poison snakes will not bite you; they'll run away. It'll also say that the four great kings will always protect you. And it says it will also protect you if you enter a battle. They'll neither be killed or injured. So this means that practicing the Prajnaparamita as an awareness mantra also has great benefits. Not only is that there's awareness mantras in there, but in the sutras, but if you practice the mantras, the sutras themselves as an awareness mantra, that also has the same benefits. Likewise, it also says in the 9th vesicle of the Prajnaparamita in 100,000 lines that transcendent prajna is the great awareness mantra. It is the unexcelled mantra and the mantra equal to the unequaled. And there's also a great treatise on the Prajnaparamita treatise on the commentary on the 100,000 line sutra, said to be written by Nagarjuna. It's not in Tibetan. In its 58th vesicle, it says that among all awareness mantras, transcendent mantra is the greatest, it says. And so this is about the Mahayana. Likewise, during when the teachings of secret mantra spread, the presentations such as the Quig of Awareness, that the Vidyarajan became extremely important. So what we can understand from this is that the properties of a mantra, or the nature of a mantra, were also present from the very beginning. You could say like the seeds of it, or the critical points of it were probably present from the period of early Buddhism. So now to kind of give a summary of the topic of awareness mantras. We've spoken a lot about awareness mantras. We need to summarize it. So for the summary of awareness mantras, the first thing we need to remember is that in early Buddhism, the Buddha did prohibit using awareness mantras or sciences. He accepted that there was awareness, or the airs and but using awareness as a mantra, as a spell, or using it as an awareness mantra. But he also called the ultimate wisdom, he did also call that by the term awareness. That's one point. The second point is that the word awareness has many different meanings. For example, first of all, in the Buddha's words, the awareness can mean the ultimate wisdom, the highest wisdom. This is called awareness. And so the word awareness is described wisdom. The second is that in general, awareness can be like a field of knowledge or a science. Likewise, the third is that in the Mahayana, the meaning of awareness or uh, expanded, for it also means the five sciences that a bodhisattvas must study. And it speaks about the sutras that have mantric properties, are often called, we often hear about the mantra of great awareness. And then the fourth point is that in the secret mantra, awareness, the awareness is spoken about, and that awareness can talk about the knowledge related to the activities related to the mantras, or can talk about the ancient sciences. So in the ancient days, the awareness mantra, awareness of that the fields of science that were very similar, like the areas of knowledge. So the areas of the medicines and substances and mantras are all like the science at that time. If you if you get sick, you have to take medicine. If you take that, then you need to. If you get better, then you believe it. And they considered the mantras and medicine to be the same. So using mantras and taking medicine are some. We believe that taking medicine medicine benefits us, and there are people who believe that using mantras helped. So in that sense, in the old days, the mantras are very similar to the science. So just as we believe science now, in the old days, they believed mantras in the same way. Likewise, there's also the point of the continuity and development of this. There's some aspects of that were continued of the word mantra, and so as the Buddhism spread and the concept of awareness, also the understanding of awareness actually became broadened. It got larger and broader. It did grow larger. However, its basic core meaning remained the Buddha's own individual awareness. It is what he manifested through his own prajna. It's like the realization through an own individual's experience. This is awareness. There's no change in that. So there's no difference in the Buddha's own individual awareness. And the fourth point is that, in brief, this presentation of awareness, it takes in the different Buddhist traditions, like for example, the Shravaka tradition, or in the Mahayana tradition, or in the secret mantra tradition, that does take some different forms in those, but they all primarily originate from the way the Buddha's wisdom was presented. So they come about, they all arise from the way the Buddha described and presented his wisdom. In any case, fundamentally, it continued to develop. And so for that reason, what we can understand from this is that think about the development of the philosophy of Buddhism and practice of Buddhism. And this shows us how much of a relationship there are between the developments in Buddhist philosophy and the development of the different Buddhist traditions. Likewise, another thing that it shows is that the Buddhist Dharma, when it was flourishing, it flourished in many different cultures. For example, when it's in India, it spread in China. When it spread in China, it developed and adapted to to Chinese culture. And when it spread in Tibet, it adapted to Tibetan culture. And it also spread in different eras. And so it shows like the ability of Buddhism to adapt to the different cultures and eras. In any case, it was always this kind of living, and as its potential, its capacity remained excellent. So we can understand that it had that nature. And it also shows that there's no real change in the core philosophy of Buddhism. Because if you think about this word vidya, fundamentally, there's awareness, or vidya means the wisdom of a Buddha, the individual awareness of a Buddha. And so this is the same in the Shravaka vehicle of it's the same in the early, understood the same in the early Buddhism. It's understood in the same time in the 18th schools of the Shravakas, and it is understood this way in the Mahayana. It's also understood in the same way in the Vajrayana. So there's been no change in the basic presentation of Buddhism, and it continues in the same meaning. So I think that is enough for today.